Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the Foundation's webinar titled Managing RLS with Opioids. My name is Carla Diezenkowski, and I'm the Executive Director of the RLS Foundation. Before we begin, please be aware that all attendees will remain on mute during the hour. We thank you for the questions you submitted with your registration. Dr. Winkleman will answer as many questions as time allows at the conclusion of his presentation. After the webinar, you will receive an email with a link to the webinar recording. The webinar recording will also be made available in the member portal section of our website. If you are not a Foundation member and if you would like to view this and other recorded webinars, we invite you to become a member today by going to rls.org. As always, individuals suspecting that they may have RLS should consult a qualified healthcare provider. Information offered in this webinar is for informational purposes and should not be considered as a substitute for the advice of a healthcare provider. Our speaker today is Dr. John Winkleman. Dr. Winkleman is Chief of Sleep Disorders and Clinical Research Program, Department of Psychiatry at Mass Gen, a certified RLS quality care center located in Boston, Massachusetts. Dr. Winkleman received his PhD from Harvard in psychobiology and his MD from Harvard Medical School. He finished his residency in psychiatry and a fellowship in neurology, sleep disorders medicine at Mass General Hospital. He has served as a committee chairman for several national organizations, including the Nosology Committee, the Movement Disorders section of the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, and the American Academy of Neurology Guideline Committee for the treatment of RLS. Since 2000, he has served on the RLS Foundation's Scientific and Medical Advisory Board. Dr. Winkleman's research interests include sleep-related movement disorders, insomnia, and parasomnias. He is a leading expert in the field of RLS and has published several textbooks and authored over 100 articles in the field of sleep medicine. Dr. Winkleman, we thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us today, and I invite you now to begin your presentation.
Thank you very much, Carla, and thank you for that flattering and articulate introduction. I want to thank everybody who's listening to this for your interest in this topic. And we've got a lot to cover today. And I'm going to try to move somewhat quickly through the slides so that we have adequate time to address questions afterwards. But remember that the program is available by audio tape if I move too quickly at some point, and I do apologize for that. So what we're going to do here today is I'm going to talk about how it is that people get to the option of using opioids for RLS, the steps that your physician and you will need to take prior to initiating opioids for RLS. We will then talk about specific opioids that are used for RLS. It looks like I didn't finish my summary. I apologize. And at the end, I'm going to be sharing some data from the National RLS Opioid Registry, which the RLS Foundation has supported and is a project that I'm doing at Mass General Hospital. And I'm hoping that if there are people who are listening to this and are not part of the registry, that you would consider participating, because that is how we're going to learn more about the use of opioids over the long term for this very distressing disorder. So before we talk about opioids itself, we're just going to give a little bit of an overview of RLS treatment. And what I say to each and every patient that I see with RLS is there are 4 classes of treatments for which there is good evidence that there is efficacy. Those are the dopaminergic drugs, Requip, Mirapex, and Nupro. Those are the brand names. The calcium channel alpha-2 delta ligands, gabapentin, also known as Neurontin, Lyrica, and Horizont. We've got 3 there. The opioids, and we'll see specific members of that class in a minute, and then iron, either by mouth or intravenously. We really only have 4 established classes of treatments for this disorder. So certainly better than it used to be when I started out treating people with RLS, but it's not unlimited, and we need to recognize that. Dopaminergic treatments have been used for restless leg syndrome for certainly 25 years, and they're very effective. They're very, very effective. However, over the long term, as I'm sure you're aware, for any of you who are on this call, they can lead to problems. The main problem that we see is this phenomenon called augmentation, where people develop symptoms that start earlier in the day than before they started the medication. So maybe they had symptoms at 10 o'clock before they started the medicine, and over time, maybe a year later or 2 years later, they start at 6, and then maybe their doctor adds some more medicine, have them take it earlier, and then they find that it's starting at 2 in the afternoon, and then a few years later, maybe it's starting at noon or 11 o'clock in the morning. So there's expansion of symptoms time-wise. You can also see an expansion of symptoms from the lower extremities, the legs, to the upper extremities, the arms. Symptoms also become more severe. So when they're present, they're much more bothersome and motivating. People have to get up and move, harder to dispel with movement. And fourth, the symptoms start more quickly after periods of immobility. So this is augmentation. And this is a primary challenge that is facing clinicians who are treating people with RLS. Unfortunately, many doctors are unaware of this phenomenon of augmentation, and they are comfortable using dopaminergic drugs, and maybe a little bit too comfortable. So they increase the dose of the dopaminergic drug, Requip or Mirapex usually, when things worsen. They say to their patients, okay, yeah, I understand it's not working as well. Why don't you just double the dose? Why don't you take 1 early or 2 early, like instead of just 2, before bed, take 2 early and 2 before bed. And so then that usually addresses the issue temporarily, because augmentation is in the background continuing it's a process that continues, and in fact is more pronounced at higher doses of the dopamine drugs. So when you increase the dose, you're just, as you can see here from my graphic, you think you're putting water on the fire, but it's really gasoline that you're putting on the fire. And you can see here with this bidirectional arrows, RLS gets worse due to augmentation, so you increase the doses, which makes it worse, and then you have to increase the doses, and round you go, and people end up on, unfortunately, very high doses of these dopamine drugs. So when I see somebody in my office for the first time, at this point in time, 3/4 of those people, maybe more, have augmentation. So in addition to getting a careful history of the medicines that they've tried and the doses and the times that they've used them, there are a variety of other things that I ask about. Excuse me. Obviously, first thing I'm going to check is no one leaves the office without having blood tests for iron. In particular, we check for ferritin and what's called transferrin saturation, which we have to get 2 labs to understand. That's iron itself, iron levels, and TIBC, which is the level of the protein that carries iron around. And iron divided by TIBC should be more than 20%. But basically, these are the 2 things that you will want to have checked for you regularly, particularly if symptoms are worsening. I will also assess what medications people are on, because medications can worsen RLS. In particular, the serotonin antidepressants, the SSRIs or the SNRIs, so this is Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft, Celexa, Lexapro, Effexor, almost all the antidepressants can make RLS worse. going to ask about medicines that block dopamine action. And there's some medicines that people use for GI problems. There's some dopamine blockers that people use for psychiatric problems. And I'm also going to make sure that people are not taking short-acting opioids that may lead to interdose withdrawal, i.e. if they're taking them let's say in the afternoon because they've got pain, and then they don't bother to take them at night, they could be actually withdrawing from the opioid at night, and that could make the RLS worse. I'm going to find out about coexisting sleep disorders. So maybe they've got insomnia as well as RLS. And that needs to be, we need to know that, and it may need to be addressed. And I'm certainly going to find out whether somebody's at risk for sleep apnea and maybe do a sleep study. I'm going to ask very carefully about the timing of the medications that people take. Roughly a quarter of the people that I see, it's not that the medicines aren't working, it's just that they're not well distributed over the course of the day. They may not have any symptoms in the morning, but for some reason their doctor's having them take pills in the morning, short-acting pills for RLS in the morning. Why are you taking them in the morning? I don't know. That's what my doctor told me to do. So I'm going to think carefully about when they're taking the medicine and see if that's optimally timed for their RLS symptoms. I'm also going to tell people that I don't intend to get rid of all RLS symptoms. Generally, there are milder symptoms during the day, morning, afternoon, maybe even early evening, morning, afternoon, and early evening that can be addressed just by moving, stretching for 15 minutes, and you can go back to doing what you were doing. And those kinds of symptoms can be alleviated by the person with that kind of activity. I want to focus RLS medicines on the most problematic times, which is clearly at night. If they're problematic during the day for work or other activities, okay, then I'm going to have those as an independent priority for treatment, but I don't want to give the idea that we need to eliminate all RLS symptoms. And as I said, the sleep study is usually not necessary unless sleep apnea is suspected. So getting back to augmentation, augmentation exists along a continuum. And it can be just mild, where you can just change the dose or change the timing, or it can be more severe, where symptoms are present much of the day. And it's certainly those patients who we're oftentimes going to be thinking about opioids for. So what are the options for treating augmentation? This is not an augmentation talk. I know you had one of those recently, but in short, we can switch from shorter acting dopamine drugs to longer acting dopamine drugs. We can give iron, or we can say, to heck with it, this dopamine drug is really producing more problems than benefits, and we have to eventually discontinue it. I don't discontinue the dopamine drug until I've started the new drug that's going to address the RLS symptoms. And then under cover of the new drug, when things are better, then I will gradually reduce the dopamine drug. Before starting an opioid, every individual needs to be assessed with what's known as the opioid risk tool. And I'm going to jump to that here. This is something that all doctors use, hopefully, when they're starting an opioid. If they're not doing it explicitly with you, they're doing it in their minds to get a sense of what the risk of an individual patient is of misuse or abuse of an opioid. And you can see that family and personal histories of substance abuse give you a lot of points here. If you're on the younger side, that gives you some points. Women with a history of pre-adolescent sexual abuse and trauma, that gives you points. and any kind of psychiatric disease. In particular, you can see ADD, OCD, bipolar, and schizophrenia seem to be more of a risk than depression. However, I think that it's not clear that these points are absolutely accurate and evidence-based. And you add up the points, and then you can get a sense of the risk. Now, I can imagine that some people are thinking, well, what if I am actually in the moderate or even high-risk group? Does that mean my doctor's not going to prescribe the opioid? And I think that that really depends upon each doctor. I can tell you that it will not prevent me from using an opioid for someone with severe RLS, but I'm going to be more careful, and I'm going to have a longer discussion with the individual about the risks. And I may even have family members be involved and hold the medication and dispense it regularly. But it doesn't prevent me from prescribing one of these opioid medicines. I'm sorry, I don't know if these pop-ups are showing on your screen, but I'm trying to get rid of them. So let's go back to the question of what do you do before you start an opioid for RLS? So we use the risk tool. We look on state prescription monitoring programs. Roughly 20 states in the United States have all of their scheduled drugs, those that are more concerned for misuse and abuse, entered into a database. The pharmacy actually enters it when they dispense the medicine, and doctors have access to these databases. In Massachusetts, I cannot write any opioid prescription, even if somebody I've been seeing for 10 years. Each time I write a new prescription, I have to check with the monitoring program to make sure that I'm the only doctor that's writing it, or if someone else is writing it, I have a conversation with the patient and with that doctor about why there are two people writing these medicines. This is to avoid people who are trying to doctor shop. And it's a really good resource and protects patients. It allows doctors to feel more comfortable prescribing this class of medicines. In some patients, we will get a urine test to see whether there are other medicines that we would have concern about in combination with opioids. We may do that before starting the opioids, or we may do it here and there during the treatment. And I have an agreement or a quote unquote contract with every individual who I'm prescribing opioids for that describes my responsibilities and the patient's responsibilities while they're taking this medication. So now we can jump into, let me look at the time, we're doing pretty well, I think. I can jump into specific opioids. And you can see here the most common opioids that are used for RLS. This comes from Mike Silber's, he's the first author paper in Mayo Clinic Proceedings, and I was involved in this group that came up with these recommendations. If you don't have access to this paper, I would try to get it either from the foundation or online. It's really a good thing to print out, to have a number of copies, and take to your doctor and show them the paper. So you can see the different opioids that are used, from tramadol to codeine, morphine, oxycodone, either in immediate release, or OxyContin, which is oxycodone continuous, hydrocodone, or methadone. I predominantly prescribed methadone for my patients using opioids. I feel most comfortable with methadone for a variety of reasons. One, because no one gets a buzz from this medicine. It really just does not seem to produce euphoria for people, which therefore relieves my mind and relieves patients' minds, because people taking opioids for RLS don't want to feel altered. They just want their RLS to go away. So I feel very comfortable with that aspect of methadone. The other thing is that it's a long-acting medicine, and most of the people that I see have symptoms much of the day. And you can see in the right-hand column that the usual effective dose is somewhere between 5 and 20 milligrams. I do not prescribe more than 20 milligrams of methadone because I don't find that it's necessary. I'll start individuals either at 2.5 or 5 milligrams. So I have some different questions that may be on your mind about the types of opioids and the conditions under which opioids might be prescribed. And so people will ask me, why, and doctors will ask, when would I use a short-acting opioid like oxycodone or hydrocodone, which would be Vicodin, versus a long-acting opioid like methadone? And so here's some of the answers. So why would we use long-acting opioids? And as you can see here, the reason I use them is because most people who are starting opioids for RLS have RLS symptoms roughly 14 to 18 hours a day. So let's say from 4 o'clock in the afternoon till 6 o'clock the next morning. So this is much of the day. And to treat that with a short-acting opioid, we might have to use 2 or 3 administrations. So people would take it at 3 o'clock, and then they might have to take it at 8 o'clock, and then they might have to take it at bedtime. They might have to wake up in the middle of the night to take it. And I don't like the idea of people popping pills. Should I take 1? Should I take 2? Oh, it's not that bad. I'm going to hold off. I don't want the decision to be on an ad lib basis. How much should I take? When should I take it? I want it to be very predictable day to day. And with the long-acting opioids, generally people can take them once or twice a day, and you don't have to worry about when to take it and how much to take it. It's already been coordinated with me. So that's the advantage of the long-acting opioids. What's the disadvantage of the short-acting opioids? I have more concern about feelings of euphoria and people getting a little bit of a buzz with the short-acting ones like oxycodone. Now, those of you who are taking it might be thinking, well, I don't feel anything with it. And that's exactly what I would want. But there's more concern because those medicines get into the system more quickly and then wear off more quickly. I also have more concern about their wearing off. As they wear off, people can have withdrawal symptoms, which can manifest in a variety of ways. But one way is that their RLS becomes very severe as the opioid wears off. As I talked about, I don't like the patients kind of needing to make decisions. How much should I take? Should I take it now? Should I wait? I really want it to be on a very predictable basis day to day to prevent symptoms, because as you all know, much harder to catch up with symptoms than to prevent them. You need higher doses of medicines, and there's a lot of distress when you're trying to catch up when the horse is already out of the barn. So I only use short-acting opioids for those who have symptoms for a few hours a day, and in those cases, I will use the opioid, but I'm going to keep a close eye on things to make sure that there is no withdrawal, that there's and that medicine's being used as I expect it to be used. Many people ask me, well, do you really want me to take both my gabapentin and my methadone? And my answer is yes, because hopefully each one of those drugs, which work in very different ways, can pull some of the weight of the treatment. And therefore, you end up on lower doses of each one of them, and therefore have less side effects from each one of them, because you're taking 2 different medicines with 2 different sets of side effects and mechanisms of action. And many of the people that I'm treating who have augmentation, I've started a Lyrica or a gabapentin. I've cranked it all the way up. Maybe it wasn't fully effective. And so then I will add the opioids. And then, unfortunately, they're on 3 medicines. They're on a dopamine drug, they're on gabapentin, and they're on the opioid. The opioid, that hopefully works. Then we can taper off the dopamine drug and then hopefully taper down to the lowest effective dose of the gabapentin and of the opioid. So this process of getting people off the dopamine drug and onto an effective drug is time consuming and produces, unfortunately, distress, because stopping the dopamine drug is a really difficult process. But in the long run, it's worth it, because you know then that you are not on the medicine that's making things worse, and you're hopefully on the lowest dose of the other medicines. Should people be on benzodiazepines with opioids? I am very careful about this because this combination is dangerous. However, many people have significant anxiety just because they have an anxiety disorder, whether it be generalized anxiety disorder or panic disorder, and those make RLS worse. Anxiety disorders really crank up RLS symptoms for unclear reasons. And so this is a way of keeping the RLS treatment dose low by treating the anxiety disorder. Okay, now I got a bunch of slides on side effects, because opioids have side effects. Most common, and I put them kind of in order of frequency. The most common side effect with opioids is constipation. Almost everybody who's taking an opioid gets constipation. If you're lucky enough to not have that, well, I would say go in peace. And you should be very pleased with that. But most people do have constipation. How do you avoid that? Make sure you're drinking enough fluids. Stay active, because sitting around increases the likelihood of constipation, whereas activity levels make our bowels move. Use stool softeners like Colace, laxatives, the gentler ones like Senna, or more powerful ones like Miralax. And if things are really not moving, we use a prescribed medicine called Movantik, which is an opioid blocker that just works in the gut. So it won't interfere with the action of RLS in the brain, for action of the opioid for RLS in the brain, but it'll interfere with the opioid actions at the gut. Again, with constipation, you want to stay ahead of it, because the worse the constipation is, the worse it gets. And you go round and round and round, and people can end up very sick from being constipated, and end up kind of feeling very bloated and nauseous and losing their appetite as a consequence. Second most common side effect we see is nausea, usually at the beginning of treatment. So people do develop tolerance or accommodate to this side effect. The nausea that I hear about is mostly in the morning. And I will use an anti-nausea medicine. The one that I use is called Zofran, which is very commonly used, quite safe. And it's what now little kids who come into the emergency room with bad vomiting and diarrheal illnesses, they give them Zofran, and it really, really helps. It was originally developed for cancer-related nausea and vomiting. So this can be used as needed, when the nausea is bad, and not use it when it's not present. And usually, as I said, it's time limited. The nausea goes away after usually a period of weeks. Daytime sleepiness is a not uncommon side effect with opioids. You try to keep the dose as low as possible. You try to limit other medicines that are sedating. You adjust the timing and the dose, or I already talked about the dose. You adjust the timing of the medicine so that the sleepiness hopefully is just present at night, which is not such a bad time to be sleepy. And if very bad, you can use a stimulant, whether it be caffeine or a prescribed stimulant. Sweating is a side effect that has, in some of my patients, interfered with their ability to use an opioid, because the sweating was so bad. And I understand that this is a major issue. it's very uncomfortable, and socially it's a problem as well. In men, I'll check testosterone levels because hormone levels can be reduced. Androgen or testosterone levels can be reduced from the opioid, and that could be leading to the sweating. If you're taking methadone, you need to get an EKG before treatment, certainly after treatment, and your doctor will look at the EKG and determine whether it's of concern. Because methadone can irritate one aspect of the conduction system in the heart, which could be potentially dangerous. And we check the EKG, and if it looks okay, then we're not concerned about this side effect. As I mentioned before, almost all opioids can affect the production, the making of testosterone. And testosterone levels should be checked, probably prior, but certainly after somebody begins an opioid, just to make sure that this is not an issue. The main things that we hear that could be the result of low testosterone are sexual function, as well as libido, desire, effects on mood, and effects on energy. So I will hear people describing that libido is reduced and energy is reduced, and people can become apathetic. And so I always, under those conditions, look for testosterone levels. And if they're low, then I'll refer them to their primary care doctor or to a urologist or reproductive endocrinologist to consider the use of testosterone. Of course, testosterone should not be used in men who have prostate cancer because that combination is dangerous. Some opioids can produce insomnia. Strangely enough, I already said that they make some people sleepy, but weirdly enough, they can also produce insomnia in some people. And if that's true, or if people do have insomnia, you need to really make sure that it is the opioid that's doing it and not one of many other causes of insomnia. Also, occasionally people can have depression or irritability from opioids. I see my patients who are on opioids every 3 to 4 months. That is a Mass General Hospital requirement and a state of Massachusetts requirement. And I take that very seriously. If people are in Florida for a couple of months, maybe it'll go to 5 months, but I really like to see people and really require it every 3 to 4 months. I assess RLS symptoms, I assess side effects, I assess other medical and psychiatric issues, and this is a state law, and I follow it very carefully. If there's any suggestion of sleep apnea, either obstructive sleep apnea or central sleep apnea, if there's loud snoring, if there's pauses in breathing, or if people are having a sleepiness that I can't account for, I'm going to do a sleep study. And generally, people's RLS stays relatively stable once they're on an opioid. The dose stays stable and their symptoms stay stable. Yeah, there may be a few bad days here and there, or maybe a bad week. But if there's a change, I'm going to want to see the person and want to discuss with them in detail any of the things that we've talked about before that could make their RLS worse. Because I really don't want to change the medication dose if something else is making the RLS worse. As I said, I do urine screens in some people, not in all people, and I'll do it just kind of whenever I feel like it. If there's some suggestion of that there could be another medicine being used, or if people are using their opioids at a rate that concerns me, I'm going to check a urine screen for opioids or other substances of abuse. I try to stay in contact with primary care or other providers by sending my notes to them, making myself available to discuss with them the use of the opioids for RLS. And I try to have a family member who comes to appointments with patients who are on opioids for RLS so that I can get their perspective on whether there have been any changes in mood or behavior, whether they have any concerns about the use of opioids in their family member. And if there are concerns, either due to memory issues or behavioral issues, I will have that family member be the responsible party where the opioids are kept, and they will dispense them either daily or weekly to the patient. This way, everybody can be assured that these medicines can be used safely. I'm going to just spend a couple minutes talking about the RLS registry before I go to questions. For those of you who are listening who are on an opioid for RLS, I would strongly encourage you to participate in the registry. This is how we are going to learn more about the use of opioids for RLS, not just on a short-term basis, but on a long-term basis. And this came to my mind because, as some of you may know, I was very involved in the approval of Mirapex, a great drug for RLS, in the short term. And I was the first author on the paper that, the pivotal paper for FDA approval, and it looked great. And in fact, it is a great drug for short term, but the study was only 12 weeks long. And it became apparent as we were doing the study even, and certainly afterwards, that over the long term, these medicines are not great for everybody. And so I want to make sure this time that I have long-term information on the use of opioids. There are certainly studies that have been published. Dr. Ando, Dr. Allen, Dr. Walters have done studies, but they're smaller, and Dr. Trankwalder, but they're smaller and shorter. And I want to do a big, long study to get a sense, just to make sure that my beliefs about these medicines are really true, number one. And number two, to convince practicing doctors in the US and regulators at the state level that these medicines can be used safely for RLS. And it is only data that is going to convince people. Just my say-so is not going to do it. How might you join the registry? You can just Google MGH opioid registry. You can ask people at the RLS Foundation how to join. It's very easy. Contact me if you have any questions, but I would encourage you to join. It's really very easy. The goals of the registration are to establish national data on long-term opioid treatment of RLS and try to figure out, do these medicines work long-term? What's the risk of misuse or abuse? How often do people start opioids and stop them? And if they do stop them, why do they stop them? Here you can see the outline of the flow through the registry. There's an initial phone screen, which takes 5 or 10 minutes with my coordinator, and where they see whether it makes sense for you to be part of the registry, whether it makes sense for you and whether it makes sense for us, whether you meet our criteria. Second, if you do, Julia will schedule a phone interview, which takes anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes and covers a lot of questions about your RLS over time and how you're doing now. Within 1 week, we ask you to go online and do an online survey that's on this REDCap platform. And REDCap is a commonly used platform for collecting data in a confidential way. All of the information is stored at MGH in my research office. No one has access to it other than me and Julia. And your name is not on the data. There's just a number, and then we have a separate file where we keep a connection between your number and your name. So it's really highly protected. So there's that phone interview, the survey within 20 minutes, and then every 6 months, you're going to get a link which connects you to the REDCap platform, and you answer questions again, about 20 to 30 that are basically the same questions that you've answered before, but we're just updating our information. So here's preliminary results from our registry. I'm going to spend 5 minutes on these results, then we're going to go to questions. And this is on almost 400 participants who we've enrolled in the last 15 months. And I think Julia is listening to this, and she has been an extraordinary asset. She's going to medical school at the end of June, and I'm going to miss her terribly. She's done a great job. As any of you who are participating in the registry know, she's going to be a great doctor and has done a great job interviewing all these people. 60% of the participants are female, 98% are white, and this probably corresponds to the fact that that's the outline of people in the US with RLS, predominantly female and Northern European Caucasian population. Almost 2/3 have a family history of RLS. We do have a highly educated group of participants. Almost 3/4 have a college or graduate degree. You can see here there's an age distribution. The average age is 65, although we do have some young people. Youngest is 24, oldest is 89, so everybody is welcome. Here you see a beautiful map of participation. The darker the color is, the more participants we have. You can see that we have a lot of participation from California, as you could expect, because it's the most populous state. We have many from Massachusetts, as you can imagine, from the DC, Maryland area because of Dr. Early's participation, Texas, Florida, Pennsylvania. What's that big state there below Pennsylvania? Maybe that's Virginia. But we've really got a great nationwide participation. Nobody from Alaska, I think. So I'd love to get somebody from Alaska. We have people who are on opioids. Obviously, you have to be on opioids to be in the registry, but you can also be on dopamine agonists or gabapentin, Horizon, Lyrica. And 9 out of 10 people who are in the registry on opioids have experienced augmentation. Most people are taking a single opioid are taking an opioid without any other medicine. About 1/4 are also taking either gabapentin, pregabalin, or Horizon. In addition, 16% are taking the opioid and a dopamine drug, and 7% are taking one from each category. Of the opioids, 42% of the people in the registry are taking methadone. 26 are taking some kind of oxycodone preparation, either oxycodone or OxyContin, and then we've got some others of other things. When we look at side effects, as you can see here in the lower right, over 1/2 of people have constipation, about 1/4 have drowsiness or fatigue, itching, which I didn't mention before, is present, and almost 1/4 sweating, changes in appetite. The average dose of methadone is 10 milligrams. The average daily dose of oxycodone is 20 milligrams. Then we look at severity. We do the RLS severity scale, which is what's done in clinical trials, and we administer this at each of the times we talk to people, or they fill out surveys. And you can see about almost 1/4 of people have no RLS symptoms. An additional 20% of people have mild symptoms. somewhere around a little over a third of people have moderate symptoms. And then unfortunately, you can see that almost a quarter of people have severe or very severe symptoms, even while on treatment. The opioid risk tool we talked about, of the almost 400 people in the registry, 3/4 of the people are characterized as low risk, 18% as moderate risk, and 5% as high risk. But as you can see, their doctors are still prescribing them opioids. As I said before, this does not preclude your participation or use of an opioid. It just will lead to closer scrutiny to protect you from the concerns that we may have. 40% of people in the registry have depression, 30% have this is a history of depression, 30% have a history of generalized anxiety disorder, and 10% of other anxiety disorders as well. And I think this is the last slide I'm going to show. Unfortunately, many people's RLS has been out of control. And the feeling of having an out of control symptom where you can't sleep, where there's no sense of any hope that it'll get better, leads to abstract or even concrete thoughts about killing oneself. So it's over 35% of people had abstract thoughts, wish they'd be dead or wish to fall asleep and never wake up before starting an opioid. Over 20% had actual concrete suicidal thoughts, actual thoughts of killing themselves. And you can see that those are dramatically reduced when on the opioid. So the opioids are not only working for the RLS, but they're working for the substantial distress that many people with RLS have. On that, I guess it's actually a happy note because we're really making a difference here with these medicines. I'm going to ask Carla to go to questions that people have.
Well, thank you, Dr. Winkleman, and congratulations, Julia, on your admission to medical school. That's very exciting, and we wish you the best. We received almost 500 questions for this webinar, so we broke them down into several categories. Into advocacy, addiction, general, treatment, research, and also communication with physicians. So I'm going to start working through those questions. The first question is, I'm currently taking opiates and the Nupro patch. Will I build a tolerance slower or faster to opiates being on both meds?
The concern about being on a dopaminergic drug if you have augmentation is a worsening of RLS. The opioid patch can be associated with augmentation. My goal in patients who have developed augmentation with a dopamine drug is to try to get them off the dopamine drug. Sometimes it's not possible, but my concern is that augmentation is going to happen, is going to continue even while you're on the long-acting Nupro patch. Next question.
Okay. What are the possible side effects on the heart with the long-term use of opioids for RLS?
As I mentioned with methadone, there's concerns about the conduction system, so just getting an EKG should suffice. Otherwise, opioids don't have dramatic cardiac side effects. So I think that people are going to be safe. You do want to make sure that it's not worsening any underlying sleep apnea that might be present that could then have an effect on the heart. But generally, opioids, taken particularly in the doses that we use for RLS, which are very low, and it's a point I didn't make, these doses are 1/10 what we use for treatment of chronic pain, and 1/5 to 1/10 of what people use who are on maintenance therapy for opioid use disorder. So these are very low doses, and in general don't have any adverse effects on the heart. Next.
What dosing and/or habits can decrease the risk of addiction?
You saw the opioid risk tool. So those are the things that raise concerns about misuse or abuse of these medicines. I try to keep the dose low. I don't like the pill popping with the short-acting agents. I want to use long-acting agents in general. And so those are the things that I aim for. The use of addiction, I think we need to use that word very carefully. I would rather use the words misuse or abuse, because people are going to be on the opioids probably for a very long time. Are you addicted to the opioid, or is it treatment? Some family members will say, well, you're addicted to it, you can't stop it. And I would say, well, if that's your definition of addiction, then this is true for diabetics using insulin, for people who have prostate disease and are taking medicines for that, people taking tamoxifen for breast cancer. Just the fact that you need to take the medicine is not the definition of addiction.
Thanks. What are the long-term side effects we will encounter after using opioids?
Hopefully I answered that question, and I'm not going to review that now. I hope I answered that. Next.
I want to write my legislators about maintaining opioid access. Is there a sample letter or template available for this?
I know the RLS Foundation has specific directions on how to contact legislators, particularly related to this most recent interdepartmental pain management agenda, which has been released. So I think the RLS Foundation is doing an extraordinary job here in connecting patients with their legislators and with the agencies that are involved in legislating opioid access. So I would leave this to Carla and the rest of the really good people at the foundation.
Just contact us at info@RLS and we'll get you steered in the right direction. What's being done about advocating for RLS patients to get opioids approved for the treatment of RLS?
Well, approved is a funny word here. The FDA approves medicines for the treatment of RLS, and there are no companies that are pursuing this in the United States. A long-acting form of OxyContin is approved in a number of European countries for the treatment of treatment-resistant RLS. That's probably not going to happen anytime soon in the U.S. However, the RLS Foundation and a number of us who are involved in RLS treatment are advocating at a legislative and medical level to raise awareness that opioids are used safely and effectively for RLS. We're working on it. Your voice is important as well, and I would encourage you to use that link or that address that Carla just gave you, info@rls.org.
Great. Next question. What is the level of understanding of the decision makers for the absolute necessity for opioid treatment for RLS?
I would say it's low, unfortunately, and I would say it's low among physicians as well. Awareness that opioids in very low doses can be used safely and effectively for RLS is quite low. Really, we need to work on doctors. We need to educate doctors about this issue, and which is why we write our papers and why we do things like the RLS registry, and why I give lots and lots of talks to doctors, because it's doctors we need to educate about this, so that when you go to your doctor with RLS and you're on a dopamine drug and it's worse, and so that they understand that there are a variety of options to treat RLS. But I think we can do a better job of educating doctors than we've done so far.
Are all opioids equal, or is one better than the other?
I think I tried to address this earlier. I use long-acting opioids because most people with augmented RLS, which is the people who are starting opioids, usually have RLS symptoms 12 plus hours a day. So I use long-acting agents. The long-acting ones are methadone and buprenorphine. Somewhat shorter acting, but still longish acting ones would be OxyContin, but OxyContin is not a once-a-day medicine. It's a twice-a-day or even 3 times a day medicine. So I really like, I start with methadone and only will move away from that if people have had intolerable side effects.
Next question is sleep architecture influenced by different opioids?
Yes, maybe a little bit, but I wouldn't dwell on that. Believe me, I love sleep architecture more than all 600 of you combined. I read 1,000 sleep studies a year, but we have to understand that sleep architecture, while telling us something, doesn't tell us a lot. So I would ignore sleep architecture, and you can say you heard that from me.
Is RLS a sleep disorder or a movement disorder? My symptoms occur during the day as well as the night.
It's a movement disorder that affects sleep.
Okay. My mother's RLS symptoms ended spontaneously when she was about 80. Is that common?
Wow, you got a lucky mom. No, I would say it's not that common, but I think I have seen it in the past. And generally, I'll always try, if people are doing well, I'll speak to them about trying to very gingerly taper the medicine very slowly to see. I say, let's play limbo. How low can you go? And it sounds like your mother was able to stop her medicine if she was taking it, or the symptoms just went away. In general, I think that that's unusual.
Okay. Will taking opioids long-term cause brain function issues?
I don't think so. There's no evidence that low doses of opioids can produce things like dementia or other serious neurological disorders. I think we always need to balance risks and benefits. I guess that there is a risk because I can't say absolutely that it won't cause those problems. On the other hand, I can tell you absolutely that having untreated severe RLS will cause problems. So I think we have the risks of untreated RLS and the benefits of treated RLS versus the unknown risks of using opioids. And in my mind, the balance definitely falls towards treating severe resistant RLS with opioids.
Okay. How do I best respond to my doctors and pharmacy's insistence that I try something else other than an opioid?
I think opioids should be a last treatment resort. So it's certainly not where we start. We use it only in more severe cases. Gabapentin, which is Neurontin, pregabalin, which is Lyrica, and gabapentin anacarbal, which is Horizon, should certainly be choices before going to an opioid. Even using a dopamine agonist before going to an opioid. So it's, however, if you've tried all those things and you've had side effects or they don't work, I would bring in the Mayo Clinic Proceedings article to your doctor and work with them on trying to have them understand how bad it is for you to have RLS and what reasonable options are.
Can opioids cause augmentation?
There's no evidence for that. Period.
Okay. Does the Mass General Registry help with prescribing opiates?
No. Mass General Registry is a project whose benefits to you are that You can see over time how your symptoms evolve, number one. Number two, we send out yearly summaries to all participants of key information that is derived from the registry. So you get to see where you fall with respect to all the people in the registry, 400 plus. And number three, over time, we're going to influence doctors' understanding of RLS and legislators' approaches to legislating access to opioids.
We're at the time to squeeze in a few more questions, Dr. Winkelman.
I'm here. I just have my lunch sitting next to me, and I'll eat it when we're done.
Okay, thank you. I just feel like, there were so many great questions that were submitted. I want to try to get through some more. Thank you. Do the dosages of opioids for RLS typically tick upwards over time, and how can the progression be characterized?
In my experience, the number of people whose dose increases over time is roughly equal to the number of people whose dose decreases over time. So yes, some people may need an increased dose, but there are also people who are able to decrease their dose over time. So I think that the average probably is not much change. Those people whose dose does need to increase over time, I'm going to put on my thinking cap and try to figure out what's going on here. Why are their RLS symptoms getting worse? And I'm going to go back to the drawing board and figure out, is it an iron issue? Is it a medication issue? Is it an expectations issue that they're trying to get rid of all symptoms? Is it really insomnia that's happening at night and not RLS? And do I need to try to figure out why they have insomnia? So I'm going to work with people to try to figure out why they need more medicine, and if necessary, I'll add it, but I'm hoping that I'll be able to find another cause that will allow us to not increase the dose.
Okay, next question. Do you have an opinion about the use of the herb kratom for RLS given its opiate-like properties?
No, I guess my opinion is, why would you use something that we really don't know what it is? You're buying it on the street, so you have really no idea how much is there, how much of other stuff is there, when we've got regulated medications that we know exactly what's in it, and we've got a long experience with it. I think just because we dig something out of the ground, or because it grows on a tree, doesn't make it safe. Some of the most dangerous toxins that exist are quote unquote natural. I would avoid the tendency to use kratom.
Okay. Do you recommend alternating different opioid class drugs if they are being used for RLS?
No, I don't see the point of that. Generally, these medicines all work on a subset of the same receptors, and I think that that's going to lead to more difficulty, more thinking about your RLS. The idea is, by the time I see people and we're considering an RLS, considering an opioid, they've had RLS for years, and it's really controlled their lives. And so every day, what they're thinking is, how are my symptoms? When are they going to start? How am I going to sleep tonight? What should I do? Should I take this? Should I take that? And all of that thinking about it, I think, is destructive. It just makes the RLS worse. So I want to try to get them on a stable dose of a medicine. They know exactly when they're taking it, how much they're taking it, and then they just don't need to think about it anymore. And so that anxiety that is worsening the RLS reduces over time. And I think that's one of the reasons why the doses may be able to be reduced over time in some people, because the anxiety about their disorder is getting reduced over time.
Have you heard of much success using the oxycodone-naloxone combination?
Well, that's available in Europe. That's the drug that's available in Europe, and I don't think we have access to that here. The idea of adding the naloxone is that it could reduce some of the constipation that's associated with oxycodone. I don't use that combination. If I'm going to use oxycodone or OxyContin, I don't combine it with naloxone. So I don't have much experience. Maybe other doctors do.
How effective is boosting iron in allaying symptoms? Sorry.
It does seem to be effective in those individuals whose serum ferritin is below about 75. I think the evidence for it benefiting people whose ferritin is above that, certainly in those whose ferritin is above 100, is weak. So if your ferritin is below 75, I think it's definitely worth a shot using oral or intravenous iron. You can't always depend on ferritin because it can be misleading. It can be high in some individuals who are actually iron deficient. And that's why we get that transferrin saturation to as a check on the validity of the ferritin value. Iron can be very helpful in some individuals, but I would say if your ferritin is in the middle or upper end of the normal range, I'm not enthusiastic about even trying it.
Okay. If we become tolerant to one opioid, for example, OxyContin, is it possible to switch to another morphine successfully?
My experience has not been good with that. However, tolerance to the oxycodone could be actual tolerance to the oxycodone, but it could be many other things. So before I call it tolerance, I will want to do a full evaluation and make sure it really was tolerance and wasn't just that there was another medicine added, or that sleep apnea is present, or there wasn't insomnia, or that it wasn't iron deficiency. So before I'm willing to call it tolerance, I'm gonna do a careful assessment. In my experience, though, it is unusual to develop significant tolerance to the opioids, and so I would really want to go back to the drawing board and make sure that a careful assessment has been made. I would probably, if I was going to switch somebody from OxyContin, I would only switch them to methadone, not to another shortish acting opioid.
All right, this will be the last question, and then I'm going to ask you to tell us about your research that you're working on. Does oral ketamine have any place in RLS research?
Maybe. It's quite possible that the NMDA system, the glutamate system, may be important in RLS. So I think that there is a possibility that ketamine could have some value. Right now, there's, as far as I know, no evidence that that's true, but I think it's an interesting question, and if only the future will know whether if influencing the glutamate system through ketamine or through some other means could have some value for RLS.
All right, and then would you share with us your current research projects that you're working on?
Well, I seem to be spending a lot of time on this registry.
That's good.
Yeah. Because I really think, you know, as we start approaching the end of our careers, so maybe I've got 10, 15 years left in my scientific career, you start thinking about really, what do I really want to do? What do I want to have be my legacy? And I really think that this information, this data that we're getting on opioids and RLS is important data. And it's important for patients, it's important for doctors, it's important for legislators. So that right now is my focus in the RLS world. You know, of course, there's always other little projects that I'm doing. I do want to get a sense of what are doses of dopamine drugs that are being used nationally. I want to educate, I want to do things that I can educate providers, physicians, about appropriate uses and doses of those medicines. I'm also doing other research in other areas, particularly in insomnia as it relates to diabetes. I'm not going to talk about that in this context.
Well, I'd like to share with everyone, Dr. Winkleman has joined us on the Hill, meeting with legislators to discuss the needs of the RLS community, and also with different agency and policymakers. I mean, we are very thankful for all of your work. And so further, I ask that everyone join us on May 3rd for the Hill Day. If you go to our website, you can join, read more about it, but we need to hit 24 targeted legislative offices. And Dr. Winkleman, you can share how important this work is to get in to these offices, talk to the staff, and get, and piggybacking on what you said, it's all about educating and making them aware of our needs. And also our opioid call to action on our homepage. We put it there. It's just click on the link, tell HHS your story, and add your comments in, because as Dr. Singh told us in our meeting, it's absolutely critical that members of the RLS community respond for us to get any call out and any legislation or policy.
This legislative effort by the foundation is important today, next month, next year, because things are happening at a legislative level that may influence your access to opioid medications for RLS. At a physician level, more education. I think, unfortunately, unfortunately or unfortunately, it's not the legislative issues that are the biggest problem now. It is the medical community that's the biggest problem. It's doctors not being educated about this, being unwilling to prescribe opioids for RLS, or in fact, for anything at this point. We're really getting to the point where many doctors have thrown the baby out with the bathwater, and they're just not willing to prescribe opioids for anything. And it's because of fear for themselves and their license, and fear for their patients. And so it had swung 10, 15 years ago too far towards the loose use of opioids, and now I'm afraid it's swung too far in the other direction. And so I'm doing everything I can to educate doctors about the appropriate use of opioids in RLS. I would mention that we are I'm chair of a workshop that I developed this coming year's sleep meetings, the title of which is "Should Sleep Medicine Providers Prescribe Opioids for RLS?" And what I've been told was that of all the sessions that got submitted to the sleep meeting this year, that one was ranked in the top, either there was the top one or the top few. There's a lot of interest in this among physicians. Doctors are really unsure what to do. They know that this is an issue, but they don't want to be the one who prescribes the medicine because they're afraid for themselves and afraid for their patients. So for any of you who live in the San Antonio area who want to come to the sleep meeting, it'd be great to see you at this workshop. It's Tuesday, June 10th or something like that. No, it's Tuesday, June 11th, I think. Yes, Tuesday, June 11th in San Antonio. But the effort here is to educate doctors. That's really what we have to do. This legislative issue is key because when those legislators write their opinions, then the doctors read them. So you got to start at the top, but also it's important to reach one doctor at a time. And so I give lots and lots and lots of talks to doctors about this.
Well, I appreciate it because it's a multi-pronged effort, and I encourage everyone to pay attention to our website. We have a webinar coming up from Health and Medicine Council, which is the firm that's leading our advocacy efforts in DC. I encourage you to get on that webinar and learn how you can help support the foundation, whether it's joining us in DC or financially, so that we can make continue our work, because the time is now. We need to, push our agenda forward so that the needs of the RLS community are met. I really appreciate everyone staying on. I know this webinar is run over, and this is such an important topic, and I really appreciate your presentation and for staying on for a longer period of time, Dr. Winkleman.
I'm happy to do it, Carla.
All right, we appreciate all your advocacy work too.
I really believe this is important. And for those of you who want to support the RLS Foundation, I would strongly encourage you to do that. If you want to earmark any of your monies for the RLS registry, that would be wonderful too. We have funding for 3 years, but I want to continue this until I am no longer practicing medicine, which I'm hoping will be a while. And we're going to need continuing funding from the foundation and other sources.
Well, I thank you, and everyone have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Carla.